So we're going to talk about data validation with functions and tables. We're going to first create a function that will disallow duplicate records from being appended to the bottom of a data list. We're going to use a table to construct a dynamic list that we can use as a reference for data validation. And we're going to use that functionality with an indirect reference to create some conditional validations. So advanced data validation. I've got a list on the left side. I've got an ID number or an employee ID number. It's a made-up number, of course, and 4 names. Well, what if we're appending data to this list and somebody does this? The problem is that you have data lists sometimes where you have a field, an ID field, for instance, that needs to be a unique value. Here, it's obvious that we've entered a duplicate value, but what if we're on record number 5,000? I'm going to delete this. And we're going to build a data validation rule with the COUNTIF function that will disallow us from being able to enter a value that's already in the data list. So how do we do this? I'm going to go to cell B12 first. And then we're going to go to the Data tab, and in the Data Tools group, left-click the drop-down for Data Validation, then select Data Validation. And in the Allow field, left-click the drop-down and select Custom. And then in the formula field, we're going to build that formula that you see in cell B8. First, put an equal sign, COUNTIF, left paren, B:B, which will select the entire column, and yes, you can do that, which is the range we're going to look to. The value we're going to look for is in B12, or the criteria, and when that equals 1, which means in column B, if the value that's in B12 can only be found one time, then this formula will be true. So this rule will allow an entry to be made in column B as long as this formula resolves to being true. I'm going to left-click OK. And now we're going to copy the validation rule from B12 down to B30. Right-click Paste Special, left-click Validation, left-click OK. Making B16 the active cell and escaping out of B12, I should not now be able to put any one of those numbers that exist in column B in B16. When I put 12 in there, I get the validation rule telling me the value you entered is not valid. That's because when I try to do that, the sum total, the COUNTIF, results in a value of 2, which doesn't equal 1, and the formula resolves to false. Putting a different value in there, like 19, Excel accepts that as a valid value. So the next thing we're going to do is reference a list as a source of valid entries. So I'm going to set up a data validation rule in cell F12 by going to Data Tools, left-clicking the Data Validation dropdown, left-clicking Data Validation, and this time I'm going to select List. The source for that list is going to be these 3 cells. Left-clicking OK. I now have a data validation rule that allows me to put one of these 3 car makers into this cell and no other. If I try, I get that message from Excel again, the value you entered is not valid. The problem with this is if I add Toyota to the list, and then I go back up to the cell that has the validation rule, Toyota is not added to the valid entries for this cell. The way to fix that is to make your list a table. And to do that, select the region that you want to convert to a table. And we're going to cover tables in another movie. Control T, my data has headers, left-click OK. And now when I go and set up this data validation rule, instead of hard-coding a list of cells, I'm going to reference the data region in that table, left-clicking OK. And of course I get Ford, Chrysler, and GM. But now when I add Toyota and go back up to the cell that contains the data validation, Toyota is added to the list. So this allows you to create a data validation rule that's dynamic. As the table expands, as you enter more content and data points, the validation list expands as well. But there's yet another way to do this. So I'm going to convert this other range to a table. Control T. Yes, my data has headers. And on the Design tab for Table Tools, you can rename the table. I'm going to just rename it Cars. And I'm going to input the name of the table into this cell, Cars. Go back to the cell that contains the validation rule. Left-click Data, the Data Validation dropdown, left-click Data Validation. And this time, I'm going to use the indirect reference function, equal, and I'm going to reference the cell with the name of the table, A26, left-clicking OK. And now when I get my data validation list, it looks the same, of course, because I've used the same 3 car makers each of the times that I've set this up. And I can add Toyota to the list. And going back to the cell, I see that it's been added to the list. So how does this benefit us? I mean, we're accessing a table either way. The second way, though, we're able to actually define the table that's being referenced in the data validation list by a value that's contained in a cell. That value that's contained in the cell is the table name. But how do we benefit from this? Well, this is how you benefit from this. You can use this functionality to set up conditional validations. The first thing that you need to do is to convert all of your data lists to tables. So I'm going to convert my list of all my car manufacturers to a table by pressing Control T. Yes, my data has headers. And in the Design tab, I want to change the name of the table to Make. I'm going to do the same thing to the Ford models. Yes, my data has headers. Change the name of the table to Ford. And I've converted Chrysler and GM to tables as well. So now that I have my tables set up, I have a column heading in columns S and T, make and model. And what I want to be sure of is when the user inputs a make of a car, that it's one of the 3 makes on my list. And when they put a model into column T, I want to make sure it's one of the models that's made by the car maker they selected in column S. So how do we do this? We actually already know how to do this. I'm going to left-click S12 and drag down to S24. Go to the Data tab, and in the Data Tools group, left-click the Data Validation dropdown, left-click Data Validation, and in the Settings tab, allow a list, and the source is going to be the content, the data that's in that table for the car makers. I'm going to left-click OK. And so now we do the other part of this. I'm going to left-click and drag down to T24, left-click Data Validation, left-click Data Validation again. I want another list that's driven from an indirect reference that references, in this case, it's going to be S12. Because the active cell in the current region that I've selected is T12. You can see that in the name box. And when you build your validation formula, it should be relevant to the active cell. The validation formula is the indirect reference function whose argument is S12. That argument is a relative reference so that when I go down from cells T12 to T13 to T14 and so on, S12 becomes S13, S14, S15, and so on. Left-clicking OK. It's okay that it resolves to an error because there's nothing in these cells for it to resolve to anything but. It doesn't display an error message, though. That's a good thing. So selecting that entire range, when I drop down and choose Ford, enter Ford into cell S12, and tab over to T12 and get the drop down, I have my 3 Ford models. Enter, tab down. I can choose Chrysler, enter, tab over, and I have my Chrysler models. Enter. And since we've converted all of our list of car models to tables, when I add another car model to each one of these lists for Ford, Chrysler, and GM, I'll have that model available as a selection choice that's valid in column T. So that's advanced data validation. We first use the COUNTIF function to set up a data validation rule that disallows anything but unique entries in a given column. We then set up a simple validation rule that references a list that's basically a hard-coded sequence of valid entries that can go into a cell with the validation rule. We converted that list to a table to make it a dynamic list so that when we added elements to the table, that list expanded, and that expanded list was reflected in the drop-down list in the cell with the data validation rule. We then took it one step further by using an indirect reference to indirectly reference a table that we named cars that's also dynamic, so the functionality from that standpoint didn't change much until we utilized that technique to set up some conditional validations where you can have validation rules that provides a list of valid entries, and those entries are based on a value that's put into another cell.